the most expensive city to live in officially. I can't believe I live here. I can't believe I am affording this lifestyle. It smells like there are a million dead bodies just sitting under Manhattan. It was this guy going around punching women for no reason. But it is gentrification. Someone will ask you, oh, where do you live? You say Brooklyn. They're judging you already. Hey y'all, it's Thomasina. Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new, thanks for tuning in. So you guys really loved my what I wish I knew about New York before moving here video, so I figured I would do another similar video talking about why people hate New York City so much. And this is mostly referring to people who already live here or people who have moved away from New York City. This is not in any order of like most hated to least hated. This is just kind of like a random order. And yes, it's September and I'm already in a turtleneck. You guys, don't judge me. But that segues into the first reason why people hate New York so much. People hate New York because of the weather, you guys. Specifically, the winter. New York winters can be so harsh. I remember when I was younger, when I was living up here as a child, my mom would tell me stories of when the snow would be like up to her kneecaps. Thankfully, I haven't experienced a snowstorm that bad in New York, but last year's snowstorms were pretty bad to the point where I didn't even want to leave my house for like a week straight. The roads are dangerous, they're slick, there's black ice, there's snow everywhere. They're impacting traffic, they're impacting work. People are calling out of work, people are getting sick, and they even impact the subway system. That was news to me. I did not know that the snow would even cause the subway to shut down. So what happens is, usually if the tracks are above ground, you have some instances where the tracks will freeze over, or there's just too much snow on the tracks for the trains to actually run on them. So you have some lines that will be completely canceled until the snow melts, or reduce services. It's just really chaotic. And of course you have to leave way early because you're most likely going to be running late. The cities do a decent job at having these snow plows out bright and early to kind of clear the roads. The only downside to that is the cars that are parked on the side usually end up being trapped by these mountains of snow that the plows have just like pushed towards the cars. So then the cars have to brush the snow back out into the street for them to get out and be able to drive. And so it's kind of just like a cat and mouse game of where the snow is gonna go until it officially just melts. So yeah, prepare yourself for the winters because they're really just awful. And then you get into like seasonal depression and then just all this other stuff. It's a hot mess. So that is one reason why people hate the city, is just the winters are just too much. They're so dramatic. Another reason why people hate New York City, and this could probably be the #1 reason, is that it is so expensive. I believe New York was just rated the most expensive city to live in officially in the United States, which is insane. I can't believe I live here. I can't believe I am affording this lifestyle. Like, what is this? But yes, New York City is very expensive, and the most expensive part about living in New York City is the housing, your rent. It is gonna cost you an arm and a leg. So if you're willing to sell your body parts to afford living in New York City, that's what you're gonna have to do. Clearly I'm kidding. But it is a lot of work to be able to afford to live here if you don't have it handed to you or if you don't come from a super wealthy family. But even alongside rent, everything else in New York is expensive as well. Groceries are super expensive. You compare a box of cereal here in New York, which will cost like $4 or $5, to a box of cereal in North Carolina, which on average is like $2. It's insane. And even if you're shopping at the cheapest grocery stores like me, like Aldi's, you're still going to be paying way more when you compare it to the state where the cost of living is significantly lower. The Uber and Lyft prices are insane, and they're even more insane since the pandemic. Depending on where you choose to dine out in the city, the restaurants are going to be expensive as well, so prepare yourself for that. Fellas, I feel for you when you are going out on all these dates and you have to fit the bill. Couldn't be me. Pretty much everything in New York City is like 10 times more expensive than every place else. New York City is a very in-your-face kind of place, which makes you very tempted to spend money all the time, whether you pass a random bodega on the corner and you see something in the window that you want to buy, or you pass a restaurant and the aroma of the food there is just so strong you have to get it. You pass a dollar pizza place and end up spending $5, $10 on pizza. You pass 5 eyebrow waxing places on your way to the subway and you randomly randomly decide, oh, now you want to get your eyebrows done. It's just everything is in your face, and so it's very tempting to spend money every time you leave the house here in New York, and that adds on to just the cost of living here. You have to spend money all the time. Yet another reason why people hate New York City is that it is filthy, you guys. It is like disgusting, and the smells that, like, the different aromas, well, I guess aroma would be a good smell. So the pungent smells that hit your nostrils when you walk into the city, they're insane. It smells like there are a million dead bodies just sitting under Manhattan. Forget about it. I don't know how tourists like voluntarily go to Times Square. That is one of the smelliest places in the city. Like, I can't even deal. My neighborhood is very clean, and I'm so thankful for that experience, because whenever I go into Manhattan, it's just like a disaster. But depending on which neighborhood you choose to live in, some neighborhoods are definitely cleaner than others, but for the most part, especially in Manhattan, you just have people that will throw their trash any and everywhere. You have people using Manhattan as their literal toilet. Granted, a lot of people don't have access to bathrooms, and so that is the reason why they are doing this, but it is contributing greatly to the pungent smells of the city. It's like all these funky smells, funky people, funky trash, funky bodily fluids. It's so funny, like when it rains and you see these puddles of water like on the streets, the puddles aren't even like remotely clear at all. It's literally just brown, disgusting water. Like, that just goes to show how filthy our streets are. Like, back home in North Carolina, I've never seen puddles of rainwater that were brown. They were like at least the slightest bit like there was still some clarity to it, but in New York, no, just puddles of brown water. Anyways, moving on. Another reason why people hate New York City is that it is so crowded. It is so crowded. And a lot of this can be attributed to the influx of tourists that are like always here, which causes the traffic. It causes the subways to be packed to the point where like there's literally no place to sit. Sometimes subway carts are so packed where you can't even like stand. Like, you have to like squish it. Like, you've seen those videos of people like being shoved onto the subway or the trains in China. Like, that's literally how it feels in New York when New York is at like its fullest capacity and everybody's going to work and commuting and everything. Like, during the pandemic, I was loving it because the subway carts were completely empty. Like, no one was taking the subway at the time except for me, so I had like carts to myself. But now it's stressful. It's stressful because I don't like touching the bars in the subway like when I'm standing up, and I am not sturdy enough to ride the subway without holding on to the bars. I'm not at that level of New Yorker yet. The overcrowding is definitely annoying, especially for New Yorkers who are like always on the go, always moving quickly, all about the speed, when we have people who are coming here who don't really live here and they don't know. We move like we have places to go. Like, we don't have time to be lollygagging, looking at the scenery and looking at the tall buildings and the skyscrapers and stuff. No, we have places to be. So when we have tourists stopping in the middle of the sidewalk to take pictures, tourists stopping in the middle of the sidewalk to look at their phone, trying to figure out where they're going, we don't have time for that. Get out the way. Get out the way. That's mad annoying. So that's definitely something that people hate about living in New York. It's just too crowded. And kind of falling under that category of like the overcrowdedness, another thing that at least native New Yorkers hate about New York are the tourists here. It's an amazing city. It's definitely worth coming to see. But sometimes tourists can be really annoying when they're just like standing, like, again, like I said, standing in the middle of the sidewalk trying to figure out what it is that they need to do and just taking up so much space. I don't even think it's the fact that native New Yorkers like hate tourists. I just think that we wish you guys would move with a little more pep in your step, like you got somewhere to be. Another thing that people hate about New York City is the crime rate. I feel like any place that you live in, when you're walking about by yourself or like out with people or whatever, you should be super vigilant about your surroundings. But I think living in New York, you definitely have to do it more so, because you never know when someone's just gonna freak out on the subway or on the street or like randomly attack you. Like there have been so many reports of like this lady on the subway who just goes around punching women for no reason. The summer before that, it was this guy going around punching women for no reason. There was a report of a man who slashed like multiple people on a subway. So you just never know, like anything can break out at any second in New York City. And so I think it's definitely a place where you have to be more vigilant than like the average city. And so I think a lot of people don't like that. They don't like living in fear all the time. They don't like always having to be on edge every time they leave their home. That can be kind of annoying, and that can be definitely a stressful environment. But you know, you do what you gotta do to keep yourself safe, and sometimes even that isn't enough. And yet another thing that people hate about New York City is the noise. You guys, New York is like one of the loudest places I've ever been to in my life. Whether it's police sirens, the fire truck, oh my god, when the kids get out of school, I try my very hardest to not be outside when it's like, let's say between 2 and 5, when kids are starting to get out of school and they're like walking home from school and taking the subway and all that. I try not to be outside, or at least on the subway during that time, because it is so chaotic when kids get out of school. Like they are so rambunctious, so loud. I love the kids, I really do, but they're so loud, and it's just, it's too much. It's overwhelming. You have people on the street just yelling for no reason, sometimes yelling at you, sometimes yelling at themselves, sometimes yelling at the little person on their shoulder or whatever. It's just always something going on, and it's always so loud. I remember my first summer living in New York City, there was that period of time where there were firecrackers going off every single night for like 6 months straight. Just the noise is too much. Okay, my camera died, but back to it. The next thing that people hate about New York, which is a bit of a controversial subject, is gentrification. And if you're unfamiliar with what gentrification is, the Google definition is the process of renovating and improving a house or district so that it conforms to middle-class taste. One could definitely argue against this definition, as it uses terminology like improving a neighborhood. These investors and developers come into these neighborhoods often already occupied by low-income minority families. They come and renovate these buildings, raise the rents, and in turn the families that have already been living here for years can no longer afford to live in those neighborhoods, and so are then forced to leave those neighborhoods, creating more space for middle class and higher income earners to move into these new builds. In New York, what we're seeing is these minority families are being pushed out, and a lot of times the people that are taking their places are those that are white. Now, granted, it's not all white people taking up spaces in these new builds, but it is definitely the minority. But yeah, that's what's happening, and that's why a lot of people don't like New York, because number one, it's contributing to the continued increase in rent in the city, which is why the city continues to be more and more expensive, because these middle class and higher income earners are moving in, and because they can afford it, it's okay to raise the prices. And so everybody that has been living in New York for years and years and years can no longer afford the city and are forced out. So many will argue that with gentrification, a lot of neighborhoods are losing its culture, losing the diversity of the neighborhood, losing the sense of community that may have been there before these new builds. And so a lot of people that have lived in New York City for years and years and years no longer really feel a part of their community, because so much of the people that they have known, so many of the families that they've grown up with have been pushed out of the city, forced to leave the city because they can no longer afford it. A lot of people hate gentrification. You have some people that are on the side of thinking that gentrification helps to improve the neighborhoods, it helps to keep the community safer, and it helps to keep the communities cleaner and like looking better. And then you have some people who are just completely against gentrification because they feel that it's kind of like stepping on territory that is not yours, if that makes sense. And you even have people who are like in the middle of the argument. They're a little bit on this side and a little bit on that side. I feel like I just said a lot, and I probably did a terrible job of explaining what gentrification is, but I also think gentrification is such a complex subject, especially surrounding New York City, and so sometimes it's kind of difficult to explain. I already know, like, even based on the explanation that I just gave, some people are probably gonna come at me in my comments, but I tried my best at explaining like what it is, especially in the context of New York. But it is definitely a reason why a lot of people hate New York. Another reason why people hate New York is because of the, I don't know how to word this, but I guess it would be because of the emphasis that is placed on your status or your ranking in social hierarchy. So kind of similar to LA, it is all about who you are or who you know or like what you do in New York City and how that can help me get to where I want to go. And so in New York, you'll find that a lot of people are just using you to try to get in with the next person, or using you to try to get in with this business, to try to get into this party. And that can be really annoying because you never know who's trying to create a relationship with you for genuine purposes or who's trying to create a relationship with you for clout. So like, since moving to New York City, I kind of caught on that people will ask you where you live and they get like really specific about where you live, which was kind of weird and off-putting to me because I'm a very like, not a secretive person, but I like to keep my personal life personal. And coming from North Carolina, people will ask you where you're from and you'll say the general city, and that's good enough. But in New York, people ask you like where you live, you can say Manhattan. They're gonna be like, okay, what neighborhood? You can be like Midtown, and then they're gonna be like, oh, what street do you live on, or what area of Midtown? Then you tell them what area, and then they're like, oh, well, what building do you live in? Like, it's so specific. Like, maybe they won't ask you what building you live in, or sometimes maybe they will, but like someone will ask you, oh, where do you live? You say Brooklyn. They're judging you already. Depending on whether you say Manhattan, Brooklyn, or Queens, like, they're judging you automatically. If you say Brooklyn, they're gonna be like, oh, what part of Brooklyn? You could say, oh, Williamsburg. They're gonna be like, oh, what part of Williamsburg? Like, was me telling you that I live in Williamsburg not enough? Like, do you want my exact apartment number too? Like, but them asking you where you live and getting specific like that is their way of categorizing you into status. If you tell someone you live in Manhattan, their ears will kind of perk up a little bit, like, okay, clearly you have enough money to be able to afford to live in Manhattan. Let's see what neighborhood of Manhattan you live in. Oh, you live in Fidei? Oh, you live in Soho? Oh, you live in Tribeca? Like, that's how they gauge the kind of person you are, or that's how they gauge your status. Same with your career. People ask like, oh, what do you do? Like, literally within the first 5 seconds of talking to someone you just met, they're gonna ask you your name, and then the next question is gonna be, oh, well, what do you do? Depending on what you say, that's gonna determine whether or not they continue listening to you and whether they continue talking to you, or whether they like are dismissive of you. So in New York, yeah, a lot of it is about status, a lot of it is about ranking, and that's why I feel like it's hard for a lot of people to form genuine connections and genuine friendships, because everybody is just using everyone, and there's a lack of genuinity, I think that's a word. There's a lack of genuinity here, and that can definitely be frustrating for a lot of New Yorkers. And that leads me to my last reason why people hate New York City. Going back to the lack of genuinity, people hate it here because it's lonely. It can be so lonely here if you do not create the right tribe, if you're not hanging around the right people, if you don't have people that love and support you. And even if you do have all those things, sometimes in this overcrowded city, you can just feel so alone. I definitely think that some of the reasons why it's so hard to create friendships here is because people have either lived here their entire lives and have already formed a bond with like their close group of friends, and they don't really venture outside of that. That's one reason. Another reason is that people who moved to New York City probably moved here with their set group of friends, and they're not trying to venture outside of that. Or they moved here, got roommates, got really close with those roommates, and now have formed that clique, and they're not trying to venture outside of that as well. When you are someone who moves to New York completely by yourself, knowing no one, it makes it a lot harder for you because you don't have those roommates that you click with automatically. You don't have those childhood friends that you click with automatically. New York City is such a fast-paced city, and people are always on the go. People are about their business. People are working crazy, crazy hours, and so a lot of times people are just busy and really don't have the time or don't want to make the time to form these connections, to get out and go out and meet people and make new friendships. And so with schedules so busy, it's hard to set aside that time to foster these relationships. And again, going back to your status and social hierarchy, people are just trying to use other people to climb the social ladder, and then they'll toss you to the side once they get to where they need to be. And so those are like short-term connections for your long-term gain or for their long-term gain. And so there's no genuineness that comes out of that. There are no long-term friendships and relationships that come out of that. Being in New York, you have to be able to differentiate the people who are really going to stick by your side from the people who are just using you to get to a certain place. I think with time your tribe eventually comes, but it definitely is hard to find it from the jump. So there you have it, folks. Those are 10 of the major reasons why people hate New York City. And of course there are a plethora of other reasons why people hate it here, but those are just like some of the main ones that I've personally experienced and the ones that I hear about the most. And I hope it definitely gives you a little bit more insight about what to expect living in New York City, or if you already live here, I'm sure you can relate to everything that I said in this video. If there are more things that like specifically come to mind that you hate about New York City, drop it in the comments below because I'm curious to see what you guys think. If there's anything else you want to know about New York City, or if you want my opinion on something, of course drop it down in the comments below and I will make a video about it. But alright y'all, I will catch you in the next video. Bye!